The email arrived with no sender, no subject, no timestamp, just a single line of text. Your story is waiting, and a street address. Marcus's fingers hovered over the delete key. Perhaps some kind of phishing scam? Maybe. But something about it itched at the base of his skull. An intrusive déjà vu he just couldn't shake. He copied the address and checked on maps, a pinpoint appearing in a far eastern part of town he wasn't familiar with. Marcus frowned. He thought he knew every corner of this town. He'd lived here for ages, ever since he'd started working at ArchiveNet. He'd watched the place evolve from a dying farm community to the host of the world's greatest data center, a facility powered by a state-of-the-art geothermal power system and saving to drives designed to retain information for centuries. The place wasn't only fully self-contained, but weatherproof, earthquake-proof, and able to survive anything save a direct nuclear strike. A safe haven capable of preserving all human knowledge and literature, even through the worst disasters. A digitized stronghold where books no longer had pages and ink was a relic of the past. And yet, as he stared at the red marker on the map, the feeling only grew stronger. The anonymous brick building loomed between two abandoned warehouses, its facade cracked with age. A brass plate, tarnished and dull, hung above a weather-beaten door of rusted metal. It read, "The Static Library." Marcus looked up at it, a wave of unease crawling over him. He wasn't sure why he'd driven out here after work. Perhaps it was just him being so type A, a details man. It was his obsessive nature that had gotten him hired as the chief archivist at ArchiveNet. What kept the servers running smoothly, every single file complete and meticulously organized. If anyone lived or worked in this part of town, there was no sign of it. The street behind him was eerily quiet, no doubt a vestigial part of the community, a throwback to before the data center was built. Stepping forward, his fingers wrapped around the door handle, giving it a tug. It was unlocked, and unsure if the building was meant to be open to the public or not, he cautiously stepped inside. Dust motes floated in the air in the great, windowless room. Towering shelves filled the space in all directions, warped wooden frames bowing under the weight of countless books. There were no computers, no screens, not even any electricity. Only the soft flicker of gas lamps casting trembling shadows, as if he'd stepped back in time to the 1800s. If ArchiveNet was the most modern repository of knowledge, the Static Library had to be its polar opposite. A place so obsolete he couldn't help but snort with derision as he looked around. This had to be some old town archive, or perhaps the private collection of some eccentric. But as he focused on the books, his eyes went wide. Though they came in all shapes and sizes, every one of them had almost identical titles. Marcus Lane, Volume 3786. Marcus Lane, Volume 4112. Marcus Lane, Volume 6609. Walking down an aisle of bookshelves, he found every single tome bore his name.
What the fuck?
His hand moved before his brain could protest, plucking a book from the shelf and cracking it open. The words inside weren't just familiar. They were literally a chapter of his life. His favorite stuffed animal when he was little. His high score on the first video game he'd ever beat. The color his parents had painted the walls of his bedroom. The smell of his mother's pancakes that greeted him every morning when he woke up. To his right, one of the gas lights went suddenly dark, flame guttering before winking out of existence. But the diminishment of the already dim light wasn't going to stop him. He checked book after book as he moved through the place, at once horrified and fascinated. Every moment of his life had been chronicled, from the most important to the most mundane, and everything was accurate down to the smallest detail. Another of the gas lights failed, and looking up, Marcus realized that more than half of them had gone dark without him really noticing. But he wanted to get to the bottom of this. He wanted to know how all this could be. Striding ahead, he marched to the very last book on the farthest edge of the library. On the first line, on the first page, it read, "Marcus Lane stands alone in the static library, examining the books that contain his life. At last he comes to this volume, the final one in the collection, the one that contains all the answers, the one that explains how it all ends." Marcus's hands shook as he snapped the book shut, turning it to examine the spine. Unlike all the others, this one didn't bear his name, nor did it have a volume number. Instead, it simply read, "The Last Day." This was it, the final day of his life. A text on what was to come, not tomorrow, nor any time after. This was a book on what was unfolding right here and right now. Opening it again, he read, the text documenting what was to come in chilling detail. It spoke of how, in a few minutes, the skies of the world would suddenly darken to a starless void. How a few minutes later, a black snow would start to fall all around the globe. Quintillions of tiny flecks would cover the earth and sink into the seas, each one capable of decaying anything it landed on, of killing anything it touched, of turning the very air and water and soil poisonous and corrosive. Marcus's fingers gripped the pages, his breath ragged as he read of the countless billions who would die writhing in agony, their bodies contorting and blistering, skin and flesh falling from bones as it liquefied into a reeking tar-like sludge, of a world filled with the gurgling screams of man and beast, of a world stripped of life in a matter of hours.
This can't be real,
thought Marcus, his mind reeling at the horrors that filled the book's pages.
How could something like that happen? How would it be possible? And even if it was, there had to be a way to stop it. The future isn't set, only the past.
The text of the book continued. Marcus Lane begins to understand that the world is already gone. Marcus's breath hitched. He didn't want to read any further. He didn't want to know. But despite himself, he read on. The world ended long ago. There is no Earth to save. There is no future to change. Marcus Lane is nothing more than a fragment, a digital echo in a failing simulation, a virtual archivist, keeper of the greatest trove of human knowledge ever collected, in a facility that survived so much, but now, at last, is failing.
No, this couldn't be.
Dropping the book, he looked down at his hands. They flickered, glitched, distorted. A sharp hiss filled his ears like television static. The air shimmered around him, pixels distorting at the edges. This wasn't real. He wasn't real. Nothing was real. The only thing that existed was a dead world, covered in shifting drifts of black snow, remembered only by a failing archive. The last flickering memory of the species who'd built it. The last dying ember of all humanity had ever achieved. The static library wasn't a place. It was a cenotaph. As the last of the gaslights flickered out, Marcus reached forward, recovering the final book from the floor. Desperately, he flipped through it to where he'd left off, his hands trembling and distorting even as he did. All was gone. All was lost. He turned the page, but nothing else was written. The remainder of the book was blank. and then the final light flickered out. Beneath the shifting drifts of black snow, driven by bone-dry winds that carried nothing but death, ArchiveNet lost power.
Like and subscribe for more horror and mystery stories.